Hi, and welcome to The Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here, we host a distinguished guest, and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran, shaking your fist at Facebook for their new music live stream policy, or else a scrappy upstart, blissfully unaware of that policy and live streaming anyway, this is your show. Because ultimately, it is what every writer seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey everybody, it's the last Friday of September, and I thank you for joining us. This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. I'm old enough to remember when you had to pay somebody called a web developer to get a website made, and it would always be some guy named Donatello who drove his parents' 1988 Volvo S70 with a funkin' groovin' bumper sticker on it, and who also tried to sell you unlabeled pills that he kept in a metal Altoids box. And old Donatello would charge you about $1,000 for a website that was obsolete in 6 months, but it's the future now. You guys, we don't have to deal with the Donatellos of the world anymore. We can have nice things now. One of those nice things is Bandzoogle. Bandzoogle powers the websites of tens of thousands of musicians around the world, from weekend warriors to Grammy winners. All the features you need for a professional website are already built in: hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, mailing list tools, social media integrations, the ability to crowdfund your next project commission-free. The Working Songwriter podcast listeners can go to bandzoogle.com to try it for free for 30 days and use the promo code TWS to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Thank you, Bandzoogle. If you'd like to hear some of my music live in the coming months, every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, I'll be streaming live for Sunday Songs. That's where I play some of my tunes, some of other people's tunes, but mainly I'm interacting with the live chat, taking questions, taking requests. The other viewers are interacting in the live chat. We've built a really nice little community over there on Sunday nights, including many listeners of this podcast. So stop on by YouTube, type in my name, Joe Pug, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you there on Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for Sunday Songs. Finally, if you enjoyed this podcast, if you'd like to help it remain a viable endeavor for me, here's a couple things that you could do to help. You could become a supporter of the show over at Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly support creative endeavors that you find meaningful. You just head to their site, Patreon, Patreon. You search for The Working Songwriter, or you search for my name, and then you sign up to kick in a few bucks every month for the show. Think of it as a voluntary subscription, a subscription that you don't have to pay, but that you choose to pay because you dig the show. If just 1% of our listenership would kick in the price of a cup of coffee every month, it would make a huge difference. So thanks to everyone who's already done that. If you're not in a place to contribute financially, I totally get that. You could still help out for free in a couple ways. First, you could leave us a rating in the iTunes store, or second, you could just tell a friend about the show. The simple math on those two things is that they will help me much more than they will be a pain in the ass for you. Okay, I'll end all the harassment there. I hope you enjoy this week's show. My guest this week cut his teeth with the indie folk band the Black Swans before moving south to Texas and releasing critically acclaimed albums under his own name. Jerry David Decicca is a music polymath. He works as a singer, a songwriter, a producer, a curator, and reviewer. His knowledge of American music is as deep as you will find among songwriters. He's produced records for Larry John Wilson, Ed Askew, Chris Gantry, Will Bealey, and assisted in many other musical projects. He's recorded for Misra Records and St. Ives Secretly Canadian. He's toured with Bill Callahan, Ockerville River, Magnolia Electric Company, and many others. His reviews and interviews with other artists have been published by Aquarium Drunkard. Uncut Magazine named his last album American Album of the Month in March 2018 and called it a thing of gentle and radiant wonder, a psychogeographical diary of the Texas Hill Country that he now calls home. The Fader noted of that same album that it was a remarkable feat of empathy, so tender and calm, and always a quietly good cheer. Pitchfork has said of him, Decicca is a careful, precise songwriter, but the songs don't necessarily sound written. Instead, they sound like they occurred to him naturally and ineluctably. His latest album is entitled The Unlikely Optimist and His Domestic Adventures, and it was a real treat to catch up with Jerry, who's been a friend of mine for many years, about his journey so far. Jerry David Decicca, thanks so much for joining the Working Songwriter Podcast. Take me back to your start, your musical start, Columbus, Ohio, turn of the century. What is sort of inspiring you to start a band at that time musically, and what other kind of music is around you as you're getting started?
Well, then it was something that I had been trying to, I guess, figure out how to get going for a while. And I had been moving around a lot. I had moved to New Mexico. I had moved to Philadelphia. And it wasn't until I kind of moved back to Ohio and started playing with some people that I had known before that, that we actually started kind of taking it in a direction to, with that goal of making a record. And like I think a lot of songwriters do, you spend all that time in your bedroom or a room alone trying to figure out how to write good songs, and then you have to figure out, how am I going to present these to the world, and am I going to make a record, and if I'm going to do that, where am I going to get the money to do that, and once I get the money, then how am I going to get people to hear it? So the first record didn't come out until, I guess the end of 2004. So it took us quite a few years. We were playing a lot of gigs. We were not touring as much. I toured a little bit with the guitar player Jack Rose at one point in time, but mostly playing gigs around Ohio and, kind of doing a lot of opening acts for people coming through town.
Gotcha. And what did the music scene look like in Columbus at that time? Was that something that you were kind of a part of, or were you guys
I was a
doing your own
big
thing?
part of it. Yeah. I mean, I was a big part of it, but not in a way that there was other people playing music similar to ours or anything,
Oh, yeah.
It was more because I worked in a record store and I was friends with a lot of musicians and friends with people with studios, and most of my friends were in rock bands, and most of my friends were older, so they were in more kind of touring bands or touring kind of punk bands or hard rock bands. I wasn't really friends with or had a community of people that were doing something, similar to what I was doing, or at least trying to do. I think sometimes I was making different music than I was maybe attempting to make, But we were playing very kind of like this very, exceptionally slow, like almost kind of like chamber folk music, but it was, it still was kind of, it was very American, it wasn't like, I think, chamber folk in the way that a lot of people think of, but it was, it was rehearsed and kind of orchestrated, and, it was violin and guitar and bass, and we didn't really have a drummer probably for gigs for the first 5 or 6 years.
That's really unusual for that time, especially to not have a drummer, because that's still kind of in the world of people kind of gunning for major label deals and thinking that they could be the next Strokes or whatever, and you went like a different direction. What took you in that direction?
I think from the songwriters that I was influenced by, I don't think that, in probably to my fault, I didn't think enough about, what could make things more commercial. And even when we were making the record, because I had bounced around so much, I knew people that were kind of in the music business that were kind of advising me to go in different directions with the record. And I did not listen to them, and that's not like a triumph of like kind of artistic integrity or anything like that. It was just kind of being kind of young and green and thinking that, and I was in Ohio and not in a bigger music city. So I was kind of creating in a vacuum, and I think that I thought, that all would hail the genius of it and stuff instead of trying to kind of make what would have been kind of minor concessions to make the music a little bit more accessible or commercial or to get other people involved in it.
Sounds like you're kind of ahead of the curve, though, because that's where a lot of like really popular folk music ended up going almost a decade later, a little shorter than a decade later, but still.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think when that first record came out, like it was at the very beginning of, we had a label put out our first record, which was exciting, that was based in Nashville, and it was kind of still at that point where there were a ton of music blogs all over the internet. It wasn't quite as congested, and there was still print media. And so the record got a lot of attention, and it was very, very mixed. There were people that loved the record, and we got a lot of kind of offers to, work with different people. And then, but it was also like, it was not like it was a universally loved record. There was a lot of, there was one magazine that, I think said that it was more depressing than Euthanasia Day at the Puppy Pound, and things like that may have been true. I mean, it was a very slow record in terms of its tempo. My voice has continued to kind of evolve over the course of the Black Swans records and then my solo records. So I think that it felt very dark to people. And it was also kind of at the beginning where people were like listening to music a lot online, and we were also making kind of choices where we had a very kind of non-compressed sounding album, and kind of making choices like that were not really connecting very well to people making decisions about music in laptop speakers. It's like, people have much better kind of sound for their digital music now than they did in 2004 or 2005.
For people who are more casual listeners and not musicians or songwriters themselves, can you kind of explain what that is to have a less compressed record, and how that favors certain listening mediums over other ones?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we had a very, I throughout college, worked in vinyl record shops long before people were buying vinyl records like they are now. I mean, it's a $40 record now you could buy for $5. So I was definitely into the way that songs communicated in terms of sound. So that led me to kind of artistic decisions that I was making about my own records. And so when we chose a mastering engineer, we chose this guy named Steve Hoffman, who's a very kind of love-hated sort of mastering engineer, and he did audiophile mastering jobs, and they were not very compressed, which meant they were not as loud. So, if you were listening to them through like your laptop speakers, you were probably not hearing the entire album. because it was much more dynamic and it had more dynamic range. Whereas if you put the CD on in your apartment on a stereo, it was a really rewarding experience, I think. So I think that's probably a good way to kind of put it in a nutshell. I mean, I definitely don't think that one way is right and another way is wrong. I think it's kind of how people like to listen to music, and I think it depends on kind of what type of music you're making too.
Yes,
and
totally
what
agreed.
the purpose. I mean this was not the type of music that you would pound your dashboard to or exercise to at a gym.
Right.
This was the type of music where you sit alone in a dark room or, something like that, wake up in the morning and have a cup of coffee, or, it was more contemplative music. And I really felt like the sound was an instrument and I still think that way about records, no matter what type of music it is, that sound is language, and that's what turns the text of songs into music.
It really reminds me of a book that I name check here on the show a lot, which is The Medium is the Message. And you really have to know what your medium is going to be, what you're going to be published to, so that you can really hone in. And I think the idea of trying to make a record that's going to be all things to all people and all mediums is a fool's errand. And you should really decide what your audience is to a certain degree, decide where they're going to be listening to it, and go for that, kind of optimize for it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think otherwise, you tend to chase your tail. I think I could have done a better job, with the Black Swans, like early on, in terms of being a little more flexible with things like that. Kind of looking back on it, I think one of the things that, you have. I think all musicians that really kind of are all in with their music and with their art, when you can get to that point where there's like windows of opportunity, sometimes you think that those windows are always going to be there. And really with the music business, and there was more of a business then than there is now, which is just more of a tech thing. But there was actually like more of a music business 15 years ago, is that, that is a business that's always been kind of preoccupied with fresh meat.
Yes.
So when you kind of come out of the gate and, and you're not as flexible, or if you don't bend as much, it's really hard to kind of make those decisions of whether or not, you're going to kind of stick to your guns and maybe you'll have more windows of opportunity in the future, or if you need to kind of go for it, and we went for it in some ways, but kind of not in others. And being in Columbus, Ohio, you're not in under the noses of managers and booking agents and labels. And I think that it is true that most people want to work with people that they know a little bit. But it was for a first record, and for even our first few records. I mean, we operated on a pretty DIY level, for a really long time, and got pretty far with that. So in that regard, I was always pretty happy with the band, but it was definitely a different time. I mean, I remember when, when our first record came out, and somebody that was involved in the record told me I needed to get a MySpace account. I said, what is that? And social media, it's going to blow over. I mean, it's like, I was very apprehensive to participate in a lot of things that maybe I should have kind of got on, because it was like 2 years later, sitting in rooms with people from major labels and them discussing how many plays were on a MySpace account, and it's just every generation or every couple years even has their own sort of metrics for how somebody can kind of monetize your music. And once people figure out if there's a way to monetize your music or not, that presents you with more opportunities or more stressors, and you have to kind of make those choices between being an artist with a capital A and a commercial artist, and everybody kind of wants to be both, but most people don't really get to do that.
I always joke with my wife that everyone just wants to be Radiohead. Rich, universally beloved, and doing whatever the hell that they want creatively. And it just doesn't usually work out like that for everybody, you know?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I honestly thought, and maybe I still do to an extent, you know, that it's like I can do whatever I want to with my records, and you know, I'm going to stand up there on stage, and you know, people are going to bow down to the genius without any sort of customer service involved in it or something. But, you know, and also like, I think that myself and a lot of people, you know, I'm in my mid 40s. I think a lot of songwriters that I'm friends with that are around my age had the same sort of point of view, because we were kind of brainwashed in a way by, you know, being in our late teens and early 20s and going to a lot of shows at the peak of the music industry success, really, and you know, the sort of early to mid 90s, and you know, we saw the trickle down of that, where, you know, songwriters were, you know, very left of center songwriters, that very artistic songwriters, like, you know, people from Richard Buckner and Mark Eitzel and Vic Chestnut and Mark Linkous, a Sparkle Horse, and then even people that are maybe more melodic, in, you know, like Ron Sexsmith or Freddie Johnston. Like, these people were getting major record deals, you know, and they were being themselves, and they were left to center, and they were playing to packed clubs. And so it felt like very real that you could do something that was maybe more in line with the counterculture of the 60s, and you could actually be successful at that, which you know, disappeared almost immediately.
Yeah, no, I kind of fell for the same thing, and now I think the modern day equivalent of that is like, you know, the biggest art form that's out there right now that people are just rabid to listen to is hip hop. So that's why you have like the lowest of the low SoundCloud rappers are still doing better than anyone playing folk music these days, because that's what people want to listen to. That's the equivalent.
And that, yeah,
you know,
and that's totally cool. You know what I mean?
Great.
Like, I think that's excellent. Yeah. Like, I have no like sour grapes about any of that kind of stuff, because I feel like, well, you know, it's like, you know, it's, you know, nobody's forcing you to make records. Like, nobody's forcing you to write these songs. You know, it's
right.
It's like, I mean, if you want to be successful, if that's your goal, is to be commercially successful, that is not really that difficult to do. There's a lot of things that I could switch about the way I write songs in 5 minutes.
Right.
You know, it's like, you know, it's like, these are decisions that we all make because we believe in our songs and in ourselves, and in you know, and then there's the other stuff that maybe that we can't control, that is just what's inside us and how we think and feel. But there are some things that are very easy to change, you know, if you want to be more popular, you know, whether it's, you know, you just turn on the radio and you say, well, there's more songs in this key, or, you know, that are doing this thing melodically, or with, you know, this many beats per minute, you know. And, you know, when I was making records, you know, I mean, with the Black Swans, when I first started, I was still using like a metronome with my 4-track at, you know, like 98 beats per minute or something like that. You know, that's only going to be, that's a limited audience. You know what I mean? Like, that's not, so there's things that we can all do to kind of, if that's our goal. I mean, I think that people I know that and have played shows with in the past and been friends with that did become more popular, I think, embrace some of those things more, or it came more naturally to them, you know. Mm-hmm. And I'm just, you know, I've just never been that guy, you know.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, you were mentioning when social media first came around, you said to yourself, like, well, this is all going to blow over. And, you know, I kind of felt the same way. I think it's also because we were brought up in a generation where it was almost embarrassing to give yourself too much over to the audience and let them know what was going on about you. You know what I mean? Like, there was almost like almost an air of mystery that you would want to maintain so that people would like your music. And we didn't really realize that we were heading into this whole new era where what audiences were actually hungering for was as much information as possible about an artist, and they wanted to see, not just the record, but the making of the record, and if the artist is willing to share their home life, on Instagram, their political views on Twitter. It was a real miscalculation on my part. It sounds like you were coming from a similar school of thought, maybe 10 or 15 years
Yeah,
ago.
I mean, I don't even totally. I mean, I don't know if I think that for me, if it was a miscalculation. I mean, I was definitely wrong about it. But I don't know if for me, if it was a wrong decision, because I just don't know if I really operate super well in those contexts. And I know that some of that stuff gives me anxiety, and a lot of it I'm just not interested enough to put the work into. And I do think that it requires work, and I think for some people it does come naturally. I definitely think it comes more natural to younger musicians that have, kind of had these tools, or these whether they're tools or poisons, I guess is debatable, but they've been in their lives, the entire time. They haven't had to kind of adapt to them. And so maybe it feels more natural way to communicate. Personally, I love the access to learning about musicians that the internet gives, but I also loved the mystery of it, And in some of my greatest musical memories are because, I didn't know anything about these musicians, so I would wait outside of their tour bus for 3 hours to be able to talk to them for 5 minutes when I was a kid.
Yeah. Who'd you do that with?
And I don't think, God, who didn't I do that with? I mean, it's just like there's, several times with Warren Zevon, Neil Young. God, I mean, I would go, especially club shows, I'd always wait around afterwards and try to say hi and get a ticket stub autograph or a record or a CD autograph. And it was always a ploy, it was always like trying to, this was my excuse to bug somebody, to ask them questions, to,
right.
Whether, and, when I started getting into club shows and, and going to club shows or sneaking into them, that was great because not only could you see people closer, you could always wait around long enough afterwards, and and if you were already in, then they probably thought you were of age, and I was always kind of using a fake ID anyway, so it was like you sit at the bar with people and talk all night long.
Yeah,
and it was great. I mean, it was just. I mean, those are some of my favorite memories, and it helped that I was so young, because these performers who I thought were ancient then were probably in their early 40s, a lot of them, but I was the kid, so people always had time for me, and so I would get invited onto people's tour buses, and I'd sit there at the bar with them, or they'd bring me backstage and they'd talk to me about music, or they'd ask me questions. Sometimes they just ask me why I was there, because I was the youngest person in the audience by 20 years.
Right. Right. What's some notable advice or stories or sort of general worldview that you got from somebody that you've talked to there?
Definitely meeting Warren Zevon was huge for me, because I was such a huge fan, and being able to talk to him about like what songs he played and what songs he didn't play. I got a whole nother layer to that, kind of when, his posthumous journals were published, and I could kind of see what he did on both sides of the date that I met him on, like when I was 17, and I was like, oh my gosh, he was a crazy person.
Right.
Like he was, he was a wild man, or even, like, it's kind of small things, like, trying to talk to Townes Van Zandt at a urinal, or, trying to talk to James McMurtry after a gig, like on his second tour. And, and I don't know if there was like words of wisdom, or if it was just that everything they said was so memorable, because, at that age, And I mean, I still truly believe that, like, as a musician, as a songwriter, or any type of artist, you kind of are what you eat, especially when your brain is still developing.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of stuff that, like, really kind of informs the way you think and the way you feel, and as well as, like, ambitions and expectations, but very much in terms of what your artistic DNA is. And then, after your brain's done developing at 23 or 24, whenever it happens, it's not that you can't be influenced again or something like that, but it's really when you're at that really impressionable age where, especially when music is everything, in a way that it's maybe it shouldn't be when you're an adult.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, and but those are the type of things where when you're listening to those records and you're living with them, and I really didn't have any other type of entertainment. I wasn't into sports. I always read, but I was very, very music obsessed from a young age. So, records and that stuff, those were my textbooks, and I followed them, and one would lead me to another. So those are things that just kind of contribute to who you are. And so, like, being able to kind of bug people after a gig was really just, it was a way to check to see if they were human.
Yeah. Hearing you talk about that, you're such an appreciator of American music. You have such a respect for the history. You kind of look at the long arc. Who would your Mount Rushmore be of American songwriters? What American songwriters do you really think are the tent poles for the rest of the music that we listen to that's important to our country?
So, I mean, I think it's impossible to kind of like remove the ones from that conversation. Like the ones that were important to me as a kid.
Right.
Were, you know what I mean, are maybe different than the ones that I think should be on a postage stamp or something. But like when I was in high school, it was like, I mean, it was all about Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, and Lou Reed.
Yeah.
And those three were the most important to me, and they were the three that really were the gateway to a lot of other aspects of American culture, because this is a time when, you're a Springsteen fan, in the late 80s, well, and a Dylan fan, well, then there's like major labels putting out a Woody Guthrie Leadbelly tribute, and then that leads you down that rabbit hole, or a Dylan biography leads you into, Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and in a Lou Reed, Lou Reed's making tribute albums with John Cale to Andy Warhol, and then you get down the Andy Warhol rabbit hole and the Leadbelly and the Woody Guthrie and the and you can kind of take that trip, which is a very different trip, I would guess, than like a YouTube algorithm. So for me, those things required a lot of effort, and they, so I don't think that I could separate those three songwriters who, to me, the one thing that they have in common, besides the fact that they're just like, they're white guys with guitars, is that they're very graphic songwriters, and I've always been a graphic songwriter. And I think that graphic songwriters are ones that have like, a sense of place and a sense of kind of emotions and imagery that is a lot more concrete. And maybe those songs, are not meant to be sung by everybody.
Right.
Maybe those songs are only meant to be sung by the person that sings them. And obviously all those people have had a lot of their songs covered, but I think that like some of their best songs would be very hard to kind of wrap somebody else's mouth around.
Right.
But so for me, those are the three. But like as far as songwriters that I think are like, I mean, I've always loved Chuck Berry. I mean, I love musicians like that and that wrote their own songs and kind of did the same thing for every song, but kind of was able to kind of. I like songwriters. I think that kind of create their own world.
Yes.
And Chuck Berry does that, and whether people like Jimmy Buffett or not, like he does that, like he created his world, like Jerry Jeff Walker created his own world, and these different songwriters kind of, John Hyatt created his own world, Iris DeMent creates her own world, and I tend to be attracted to songwriters like that, people that feel like they can create something that resonates with me, but they don't remind me of anybody else in the whole world.
For younger songwriters that are listening to this, how do you think songwriters like that you admire, how do you think they go about making that own world of theirs?
I think it's a combination of taking things from your own life and taking things from the records that you admire. I think part of it is that I do think that it was more of a conversation that I think came out of the 60s, and having worked with a lot of older songwriters, like in helping them make records, I know from them telling me that there were always conversations about originality. There were always conversations about about being unique, about not being like someone else, and I think that if you listen to like early Chris Christopherson records or even his later records, and then you go read, William Blake, like you can say, oh yeah, this is what Chris read. Like there's, this has directly influenced him. And so I think it was also that there were more conversations maybe than there are now about kind of all the arts being brothers and people kind of leaning into, various cultures, where now I think we live in a world where music is considered more kind of multimedia a lot of times, and even not even really kind of its own industry. So I think that's part of it. I think, is trying to kind of figure out what you're influenced by and how you can apply those same sort of, shapes and colors to your own life and your own worldview.
And do you think that's at tension with or diametrically opposed to what you had been talking about earlier, saying, well, there is a way to make music that you think will be more successful, which is, look at a key that people are using, look at a BPM, listen to what's on the radio. Like, do you think that those two things are mutually exclusive?
I think that anybody that picks up a guitar and stands on stage and expects people to pay attention to him and makes records and puts them out in the world and expects people to buy them believes that they're not mutually exclusive.
That's a great answer.
And that is definitely my own illusion. I think that the reason why we create these things is because we want other people to take them into their lives, and whether that is in the first day that our record is released, or whether we're making kind of what my friend James Toth calls messages in a bottle, and people just kind of find them years or decades later. That's about expectations. But I think that we all want to be heard, or else you're getting into, the tree falling in the forest conversation. It's just a matter of what we want to do and what we're willing to do for our music to be successful. I mean, obviously, like if I still think that despite, whatever sort of, democracy the internet is supposed to provide, that geography is destiny. And so if you move to a city where there's a lot more people involved in the music business, chances of more people hearing your music is going to increase. And I think that there's a spectrum for those type of decisions.
Professional songwriters with a budget behind them have their songs radio tested in different markets to discover how their sound compares to the sound of the songs at the top of the Billboard charts. But as an indie songwriter, what do you have? You play an iPhone recording of your latest demo to your Uncle Larry after he's drank 6 Mickey's hand grenades and he tells you that it sounds like his favorite Aerosmith song from 1978? Where can you get some better feedback? CoreSound is a professional AI-based music analysis tool available as an iOS app. CoreSound determines the relevance of your music to the tops of Apple Music using the most advanced neural network algorithms. You simply download the app, upload your song, select a genre and mark it for comparison, and CoreSound does the rest. It lets you know how much your sound has in common with the sound of today's most popular songs. CoreSound is available now in Apple's App Store and is completely free. So let Uncle Larry mercifully pass out in the Barca Lounger on his back porch and leave the feedback to CoreSound. You heard Jerry talk about changing your music to fit a particular style that's more popular if you want to. But what is that original sound that you're changing from? Where does that come from? I think it comes from your creative conscience, that still small voice that articulates a direction that almost seemed preordained. There's a great description of that subconscious spiritual level in a poem by Jared Carter entitled Soul Sleeping. Someone speaks. Perhaps you dreamed it even while falling asleep, that time which is also a place when you drift off and see before your eyes nothing at all. It becomes after a while more difficult to know, yet ever more familiar and coming closer always. The blind say that sounds have shadows, always a different kind of light beckoning, even summoning, not only towards silence, whatever that might grow to be as it spreads, but also into safety. Something which remains after the darkness is swept away, the part before. To remember what that was like before it began, before answering became always what happened next. Think of a time after the journey, when each sound or murmur, even a voice crying in the night, could also be your own, reflecting back on whatever rises from nowhere to greet you. However intangible, something was there before, waiting. Recognizing it is also easy, but answering is hard. It always seems to fade in widening circles. Even when it returns, you cannot speak after noticing such silence. Animals, after they gaze in our eyes, creatures who never say anything, still understand, even when we ourselves no longer care. Before we were old enough to reason, we always believed in magic. A cat who would also whisper only to us its secrets. Also forgotten now that long time ago, after you put on your pajamas, someone always read you a bedtime story. There was never any regret that each tale ended before it was over. Your breath came calm and even. All so many go on dreaming. If no one ever inquires after us, then what happened before is always. What happens next? Nothing, even. It's become such an important part of the second half of your career, or the second chapter of your career, of you going out and finding older songwriters who maybe weren't appreciated, or who maybe are due for like another passing of the zeitgeist to look at them and hear what they have to sing and say. How have you gone about that process? Did you make a conscious decision that this was an area that you wanted to go into, or did these records just come at you one after another? And how do you go about choosing who you're going to work with?
So the first time I did it was a little bit more natural, I guess. There was, and this is going back to before my first record even came out, I got invited through a songwriter friend of mine named Jeb Loy Nichols to go down to Nashville for a record that he was producing called Testifying, which came out in the UK. And that was, it was at the time, this is right after like the Buena Vista Social Club, like records sold 1 million copies, And so the idea was, what happened with Cuba, they would do with some country soul musicians. So it was like Tony Joe White and Donnie Fritz and Larry John Wilson and Spooner Oldham and David Hood and Clayton Ivey and Reggie Young and Bonnie Bramlett, and we were in Dan Penn's basement, So I got to go down there, and there was some major label money from the UK involved in that. And I just got to go down there and hang out. And I ended up writing some liner notes, and then through that I became, I don't know if I would say I became friends with Larry John Wilson, but I definitely stayed in touch with him. I was definitely very kind of obsessed with his music and him as a person. And he hadn't made a record at that point in time, and for 27 years, I guess, maybe 28 years. And I had seen him play and I had seen him sing, so I knew that he could do it. And I thought the world of him and his music. And so through meeting him there, Jeb kind of got connected to this guy in the UK named James Endicott, who had a lot of money for his label through like kind of like a Strokes type band over in the UK. And he gave us an enormous amount of money to make a solo acoustic record.
Wow.
And so it was like in an imprint of Sony at the time, and then it came out in the UK. It was a good solid 6 months of trying to twist Larry John's arm into doing it. And for people that don't know Larry John Wilson, like he was in Heart-Worn Highways. He does not appear in any of the Townes Van Zandt biographies or film because he refused to speak to people about his friendship with Townes. But they lived together for years. They traveled together for years. I will not tell anybody all the stories he told me about Heart-Worn Highways. I don't want to ruin that for anyone. But he had, they lived together and they worked together, and Larry John was kind of towards the end of Monument Records, and made some really amazing albums. And so when we finally made this solo acoustic record with him, it came out in the UK, and then the label went under, and then Drag City picked it up in the US. And then through that, I guess I kind of got the bug that this was something that I enjoyed and something that I wanted to do. And then after that, I mean, it was sort of a combination of, chasing people down as well as kind of circumstance, and sometimes people calling me up. And so since then, I've done records with, Ed Askew, who had made his first record in like the mid 60s for ESP Disc, and Will Bealey, Chris Gantry, and then worked on a lot of other kind of music projects. And then as far as like how I choose people, it's been more of, I've toured with a lot of older musicians, and then sometimes people call me up. But the main thing is for me is that they can still sing and play to some extent, but mainly that they still have something to say, or that they're interested in kind of documenting this part of their lives, because I feel like, novelists and poets, they're still full throttle at 65,
Right.
and for a lot of poets, that's, they're just getting warmed up by then. So, but for whatever reason, I think songwriters tend to be, even very successful ones tend to be like not as engaged. I don't know if it's because they're doing other things or because they don't have the structure of, kind of academia to allow them to work on things, or if they're just trying to like not take too many left turns because they're trying to maintain an audience. But I don't really feel like the epilogue of older songwriters' lives are quite as well documented in kind of this very short period of time that we think of when we're talking about kind of singer-songwriters and album makers. So that's been something that I've been really interested in. And, I've tried to work with people that are not as obscure. I mean, I always feel like, it's like when occasionally when a writer asks me and will call me a cult artist, I always want to say like an unintentional cult artist. It's like not... so I don't intentionally seek out people that are obscure so much as that they're the only ones that really return my phone calls.
Well, I know the feeling. What does it take to get someone who's at that point in their life and maybe they have decided that they weren't going to make another record, and now you're here and you've made it a possibility for them? What does it take to coax out the creativity from them again?
I think the first thing is that, why should they do this? For some people, that's easier than others. Some people have been creating on their own the entire time, and they just didn't know, kind of like how I said, when I first started, how do you get the money to do this? Or how do you get somebody to hear it? Or how do you get it out into the world? I think that requires a certain executive functioning, whether you're successful with it or not. And then the other part is like, making somebody feel like, how is this going to be a good experience? Sometimes people stopped making records because it was too disappointing. It wasn't necessarily because they didn't have anything else to say. And for other people, it's more about, what am I going to bring to the table? I'm not an engineer, so how I produce records is very different depending on who I work with. And I actually, right before the pandemic, I produced 2 records that aren't out yet. And one of them's somebody that's younger, a guy named Garrett T. Capps, who tours a lot and does really well. And we made a great record. And hopefully that, kind of how that comes out maybe changes now, because he was kind of a touring machine before all that. But, what I do with people is it's very individualized, how much pre-production work there is, how much emotional support is needed, how many, how I cast the characters, Ed Askew's record, we were able to get Sharon Van Etten on it because she was a fan, and we were able to get Mark Ribot on it because he lived in New York. And, but I also think that part of that was because, Ed is lovable, and trying to understand whether or not the person that you're working with is gonna have the goodwill that's necessary to make a record great, because you are going to be calling in favors, when you're working with budgets that are this small. Right.
That's interesting. What have you learned from that process, the production process, that you've brought back into your own records? How do you make records in a different way now that you've had those experiences?
Well, it's tough to do, I think. I mean, I've never really... One record I did, Time the Teacher, I had producers over in the UK, and I wasn't really there for it. But I haven't ever had a producer that's been very hands-on with me, and I do think that's... I think that's valuable to songwriters. I think all of us have a difficulty knowing, in a very kind of like specific way, what are our strengths and what are the things that maybe are not our strengths. And a lot of decisions you make in making a record is you want to play up your strengths. And sometimes we're too close to our own songs to see that. So what I bring, I think, that I try to apply to my own music is that less is more. And that the most important instrument that you could ever put on a record is, when you're talking about this type of music, when you're talking about singer-songwriter music, the most important instrument you can put on there is the human voice. And that is, especially for people that I like, that is an instrument that nobody else in the world owns. And so trying to make sure that person's voice is not just sounding the way you want it to, but also that it's communicating the way that you want it to, and making sure that that stays to be the sort of nucleus that everybody else is kind of spinning around, and that the focus needs to stay on that person. You're no matter how great your guitar player is, or drummer is, you don't necessarily want somebody to walk away from a record thinking that guy had a hot guitar player. You want him to remember
Right.
the song. You want him to remember that persona, because most singer-songwriters are not the best musician in the room, and they're usually not the best singer in the world. That's why you go to karaoke bars and watch American Idol.
Right.
You want to find that person that's the vessel. You want to find that person that is, that's the carrier for this thing. And, I oftentimes find myself giving people advice that I wish that I took,
Like what?
and a lot of, well, I've never really had anybody kind of challenge me on different words. You kind of, as songwriters, sometimes you get a little too married to a line, and I think also the idea that you could do something differently, or that maybe it's just kind of not your best song, or that you've repeated yourself in terms of an idea, and why are these two different songs? So sometimes that kind of stuff will happen at a pre-production standpoint, and then I think other times when you're actually on the floor, when you stand in your bedroom or your kitchen and you write these songs and you're by yourself, if you've been doing it for too long, Larry John Wilson, he heard harp and French horn on every one of his songs, and we ended up making a solo acoustic record.
Right.
You get lonely in terms of your own music, and you want to have a different experience with your songs than what you've been living with for, the couple days or the couple years that you wrote the song that you've been living with it. You want to put different clothes on it. And, Larry John, to his credit, when the record came out, and he went over to the UK, and all these, English music writers over there told him how genius the record was. He goes, "It's the record I always wanted to make. No sticks and no bullshit." And then they said, well, what did Jerry and Jeb do to produce it? And he goes, "They bought the bucket of chicken."
That's good, man.
So he said the right thing, throw your producer under the bus and take credit for it, but he would have had, the Augusta, Georgia, chamber orchestra on every song if we had let him.
Sure. It's really interesting. I think that you hit the nail right on the head there, that, the songwriter is just so used to hearing their own voice playing the song with a guitar in their hands. They almost get bored. We're starting to learn this a little bit now that everything's gone to live streaming. All these different bands felt like that they had to do different things for their audiences. Hey, our bass player also juggles, and we'll do a record review here. And it turns out that while the songwriters themselves might be bored with their own voice and acoustic guitar, all listeners want to hear is their voice and an acoustic guitar. That's what they want to hear. That's what they've showed up for. They don't want to see anybody juggle. They don't want to be there for, the bass player's film review from last week. They just want to hear that voice like you're talking about. And it's so important as you're creating art to continue to try to to listen to it the way that a listener would. And I think that listeners are just listening for that voice, the way that you're describing it.
I mean, I think that's why you go to singer-songwriter records, personally. I mean, I like people with weird voices, I like people that still sound like they just fell out of Mars. And I like people that sound regional. So I've always been drawn to that. I mean, I think it's very, it used to be very common, especially for like, a lot of R&B music. Definitely, that can also be something that's polarizing to some people. So I think that's in between, like, computer speakers and streaming and trying not to be polarizing is why, reverb has become so fashionable to kind of drench onto things, is that it pulls some of those idiosyncrasies kind of away, it kind of strips away some of, it smooths things out quite a bit. But I like it when people sound like nobody else in the world. And I think ultimately when you're in a room with somebody, if you're a real music fan, that is what you're looking for. My favorite songwriters have a literary quality to them. They don't have sort of an emoting diary quality to them, that there's something that is literary. And I think that I'm looking for that same thing in people's voice, not just when I produce them, but in my own voice and as a listener.
Your move down to Texas, what is that, 7 or 8 years now? 5 or 6 years? How long have you been down there?
Yes, I've been down here 7 years now.
7 years.
I'll never be a Texan, though. You know that.
No, I know that. I made it down there for about 7 years and never even got close. But I would have to imagine the way that you are and how you absorb things creatively, that you've absorbed a lot of Texas music in the last 7 years. How has that moved? You were kind of talking about regional influence in people's voice. How has the regional influence of Texas itself and Texas music impressed itself upon you in the last 7 years?
Well, for me, like the big, discovery, I already knew most of the singer-songwriters, especially the older ones. So the big discovery for me is been, like different types of like Tejano music and some of the Chicano soul stuff. And so that's been fantastic. And the other part is been that, I live in the hill country area, and I didn't know anything. I mean, I toured through Texas so many times, but like most touring musicians, I played like, Dallas, Houston, and Austin. I live closer to San Antonio now, and in so much of the music from San Antonio of like horn players and accordion players and is really beautiful. And also the other part is that everybody around here is a killer player.
Yes.
And it's just, I mean, there's a reason why Bob Dylan gets all his guitar players from Texas. I mean, they're falling off the trees.
Right.
And they're just, there's just, you go into a guitar shop, there's a town, like a town over here that before all this kind of put me in my house arrest with everyone else, that I go to this guitar shop and, the guy that's selling you the guitar, used to play with Ray Price or something, and it's like,
wow.
And he's a kid still, it's just, there's just a lot of great players, and it really kind of puts things in perspective. It makes going to like a brewery or a coffee shop to see music really enjoyable. And people know a lot about music, and it can tend to be a little bit, maybe, one-dimensional or something like that sometimes, because it's people grew up with Texas music or regional music. But there's a lot of layers to that type of music. So, and to be honest, as much as I understood, or as much as I loved Doug Somm before I moved here, and as much as I loved Sir Douglas Quintet, I did not really understand how rock and roll and country music and the influence of Germans into this area affected is really what made that, like in terms of like, Tejano music and how the Germans and the Mexicans influenced each other, and then how that affected, listened to Sir Douglas Quintet so long, it never occurred to me that at the bottom of those songs was a polka.
Yeah.
So like,
Yeah.
there's so much to that, and there's still the dance halls around here. So, and as well as I do, that as kind of, homogenized as maybe America seems and the world seems anymore, that when you tour around and you get off the main roads and you start playing these smaller towns, and I mean, I used to do, when I was booking my own tours, I would do like 4 or 5 shows a state. You kind of realize how regional things really are still, and that there's still Southern music and there's still Texas music, and you go up into Maine and Vermont, and there's a different way of kind of making music and making music sound up there, and the same with the Pacific Northwest and so on. So it's still exciting. I mean, I've always loved Texas music. The first time I ever was in Austin, Texas, I had, kind of quit school and was selling T-shirts for a punk band, and I walked into a bar in Austin, and there was Butch Hancock playing Springsteen's "Racing in the Street," and
Yeah.
it was 4 o'clock, and there were 6 people sitting there, and I was like, "This is the best place in the world."
Right.
So, I've wanted to live here a long time,
No doubt. Yeah, that regionalism really does still exist. Coronavirus has really given me the chance to kind of reevaluate how I do everything with the business, and touring is one of those things. And one of the things I've thought is, as I get older, I don't want to just go out and just play Seattle, Denver, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Minneapolis. Like, I think I'd rather spend my time, that I'm going to be away from my family. Like, I think I'd rather spend that in kind of more idiosyncratic places, smaller, what they'd call tertiary markets or whatever. But I think I'm going to make a real effort to start doing that, even if we have to do them in American legions. I think that's the way to go.
Absolutely, and that's probably what's going to be left, really. But
yes, it is. Yeah. I mean, there might not be a choice.
I mean,
right?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I haven't toured as much as I used to, but I would, I've kind of got a job that allows me to tour in the summer. But when I used to tour a lot with the Black Swans, the happiest I was is when we would get dropped from our booking agent and I would do things myself. and that was its own album cycle. So when I would book shows myself, I could do 4 or 5 shows in a state, and I could do 5 shows in Maine and drive 30 minutes to the next gig.
Right.
And I played more interesting places. I made way more money. I kind of developed a real fan base. And then when I would go back to a booking agent, and again, this is because my music wasn't popular enough. This wasn't a knock on the booking agents. They've got to live off of that 15, 20% or whatever they're taking. So, they have to go to the markets. And, and when I would tour with people and open with people, generally we were playing markets. But it's always important to remember that there's people in all these towns, and there's usually somewhere to play, and they're usually pretty excited to have somebody.
They really are. I mean, if you can bring people together and for 45 minutes to an hour, take them out of where they are, just give them an artistic experience that like really kind of charges them up. I mean, that's a trade that you have right there. You have a trade. A trade is portable. A trade you can take to anywhere in the world, same as cutting hair or pounding nails. If you can make people feel a certain way with songs, you can do it in any small town or any big city, and it's a really portable skill to have. People always respond the same.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's historically been true, right? That's why, it's like you see people with guitars. It's because they can't carry a piano. And so, it's like the old bluesman kind of going from town to town, or even the carny for that matter. And, it's a way to be able to make a living. It's more cost effective. It's way easier to find those places. And played many kind of DIY kind of spaces, and oftentimes then at the end of the night, kind of beg for the keys so I can sleep there, and but having those places don't always need to be music venues, and really they probably won't be for most musicians when this ends, because I think, not to be negative about it, but as a musician, the logistics and of how many people are involved and how expensive it is to put a show on the road, and how each rung in the ladder is significant to get from point A to point B when you've got a lot of people trying to work together to make something happen. Whereas you book it yourself and you drive around in a car, you don't have to worry about everybody else's behavior or everybody else, or driving 8 hours, or if the venue gets shut down, it's not going to end your tour if it's just you.
Yeah, my personal guess for what's going to go down is, the very top of the business will come back fine. If you're at Merriweather Post Pavilion or whatever, there's still a lot of money to be made there. That'll all be there. What you're really going to see hollowed out is from the 250 to 750 capacity clubs. These were places that they weren't losing money, but the margins on what they were making were fairly low, right? But, they were already in business. They had everything set up that way. They had a space, they had a staff, they had the technical equipment, they had the food and bev going on. It made sense because they were already set up. Now that that's going to be gone largely after the pandemic, who's going to outlay the money, that initial stake of money, whether it's, an owner operator or an investor? Who's going to outlay that money in what is such a risky business with such low margins? Usually when you have a risky business, high risk, high reward, right? And this is right. A high risk, low reward business. That's the way
you're supposed to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I know. I know. And all these, we've all seen, club owners like at the end of the night, and if they haven't made money, like, they understand that they're going to have a tough time the rest of the month sometimes, if they've had if you're paying out a lot for a show, and how important it is, like, as a musician, like, you go to some of these mid-sized venues, and what happens if, like, 3 of them fall apart midway through your tour, or they have to shut down for a week or something, or one of your bandmates gets sick, or are there even going to be, like, how are booking agents going to be able to hold on this whole time, and how are they going to be able to survive? So I think you're right. I think the positive thing that may come out of it is that I don't think that it's I don't want to see people lose their jobs or anything like that, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to kind of rethink how musicians have been surviving for the past, 10 or 15, 20 years,
yes,
or ever. And I don't think it's a bad thing for people to pay, more attention to music that is taking place in their own communities. And, is somebody that started playing gigs, when I was, in college at age, 20, it was a $3 cover then. You go see most local bands and it's a $5 cover now.
Yeah.
And it's, but a cup of coffee cost $8.
Right.
So, I think that people are going to start having to kind of make those decisions, or they're going to be made for them. And, it's, maybe things will become more regional again. Maybe people will start, valuing the music in their own communities more, and paying more for it, and local bands are not going to have to get bumped for a trivia night or a karaoke night, and I don't see that as being a bad thing.
This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. Use promo code TWS, the initials of our podcast, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Jerry David Decicca's latest album is entitled The Unlikely Optimist and His Domestic Adventures, available everywhere music is sold or streamed. If before we meet again you sit down to write, please remember, an expensive drug habit is not a song, a compelling Instagram account is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.